What does the term liturgy mean?
The Greek word liturgia, from ergon, work, performed for the letos, people. Originally referred to various forms of public service and eventually came to be associated with priestly service of the gods. Because of the word's use in early Christian sources, it has become part of the religious studies lexicon. Liturgy now generally means any system of rituals mandated for public reenactment by members of a religious tradition. Its public nature separates liturgical action from private or devotional ritual. And since liturgical ritual is by definition required, it is further distinguished from the optional rituals associated with the individual expression of faith. Since liturgy is both communal and required, its performance presupposes some sort of scheduled predictability as well as facilities large enough to accommodate a whole community or segment thereof. Liturgical ritual is central to various Christian communities, Islam generally, and Judaism. Not every tradition's ritual life revolves around liturgy strictly so-called. For some communities a more piecemeal practice of individual or small group worship forms the dominant ritual theme, with larger communal events functioning as annual or occasional variations. Hindus, many Buddhists, and practitioners of Shinto gather for the equivalent of liturgical participation for special festivities, but they typically perform daily or otherwise regular rituals individually or in small groups at various times during the day. One practical result is that their staffs of ritual specialists may perform the same or very similar services many times a day throughout the year.
Are there religious heroes? How are they different from saints?
Every culture has its heroes and heroines. Sometimes these pillars of strength and unusual ability represent largely secular or natural virtues. But in many instances heroes and heroines whose life stories are not explicitly religious in origin gradually take on religious associations. One typical pattern is that a local heroic figure rises to prominence on a larger scale and becomes a sort of national hero. A religious tradition formerly unknown in the region moves in, perhaps arriving on the wake of military conquest and newly established political power, and eventually becomes the dominant religious influence in the area. Heroes and heroines who had formerly been characters in folk or royal epic tales begin to rub shoulders with the saints and other prominent religious personalities imported by the now dominant religious tradition. Before long, in the grand scheme of things, at least, but still generations or even centuries, the local or national heroes begin to acquire the characteristics and virtues of their religious counterparts. They may never rise to the status of saints, but they definitely qualify for the title of religious hero. By way of distinction, wonders attributed to a saint typically speak loudly of divine power. A religious hero's spectacular deeds, on the other hand, typically reflect a sort of natural perfection. Now understood as part of a divine dispensation even if not a direct result of divine intervention.
What makes important religious practices rituals and ensures that they work?
In addition to the various primary ritual functions are a host of lesser or secondary ritual acts that help participants establish a proper ritual setting and ensure that the actions are maximally efficacious. The setting includes the space, time, and feeling that make a ritual work. Many rituals occur in spaces designated for that purpose. But in some instances separate preparatory rituals are used to mark the boundaries of a ritual space. They can include sub-rituals, such as processions or purification ceremonies. Other sub-rituals establish the boundaries of sacred time. Bell, drums, or calls to prayer may mark the opening and closing of a ritual. Still other rituals enhance a feeling or mood by appealing to the senses. The use of incense burners is an example of a widespread practice. Finally, some traditions assure continuity and purity of rituals with precise instructions on how they are performed. These instructions are often called rubrics. Because they are sometimes printed in red, Latin ruber, to mark them as directions.
What is an ascetic?
An ascetic is a person who engages in a demanding exercise. From the Greek askesis, in the interest of spiritual progress. One of the ascetic's chief goals is freedom from the encumbrances of material existence. Various forms of self-denial and increased attentiveness to inner movements of spirit are therefore at the heart of ascetic practice. Fasting, use of the simplest possible clothing and other material needs, and the cultivation of solitude are common themes in ascetic discipline. In many religious traditions, ascetics are known for their observance of silence for long periods. Ascetics vigorously pursue detachment from all that is not conducive to realizing one's nothingness in the face of ultimate reality. These spiritual athletes often appear to others to be going to unhealthy extremes, and in relation to widespread societal norms of ordinary behavior, they can indeed be extremists. Some ascetics are known for such practices as sitting atop pillars for long periods, staring at a blank wall for years, or lowering themselves headfirst into the depths of a well. But there is another important way of understanding asceticism. Every human being who works hard at living a good life practices asceticism at some level. The ordinary disciplines of dealing with life's predictable setbacks, of treating others with consistent kindness, and of shouldering all of one's responsibilities are forms of asceticism. Most religious people must make the most of the ordinary opportunities, allowing their traditions' professional ascetics to remind them occasionally of the need to look deeper in the quest for spiritual freedom.
What are mystics?
Mystics are those who have special insight into the deepest of spiritual mysteries. They often report first-hand, direct experience of realities far beyond the ordinary. There are some apparent similarities in the accounts of mystics across traditions. In a number of traditions we find two principal types of mystical experience. One is a highly personal encounter between the human subject and the divine reality, in which there is no permanent loss of individuality. This type is sometimes called theistic or dualistic mysticism. Another describes the mystic as utterly absorbed, annihilated, lost in a largely impersonal cosmic reality. Monistic is the name often used to describe this second type. There are equally telling differences from one tradition to another, and it is misleading to conclude that all religious traditions come together in mysticism. Especially in instances of theistic mysticism we find that the subject invariably describes the object of the experience in terms distinctive of his or her tradition. Christians encounter Christ and Mary, Muslims receive guidance from Muhammad, and Hindus merge in loving union with Shiva, for example. There are surely points of important crossover in the mysticisms of the various traditions. Still, the differences remain and must be acknowledged.
What is a saint?
Individuals who embody to the highest degree a religious tradition's spiritual ideals function in a variety of ways. Some traditions, such as Sunni Islam and various Christian denominations, emphasize the importance of each individual's direct relationship with the Supreme Being. They teach that no human being has the power or authority to act as a mediator for anyone else. But the need for help in achieving the highest spiritual aspirations seems to run so deep that examples of saintly characters appear in the histories of virtually every religious tradition. The ability to perform miracles is a major feature in some traditions. Healing is perhaps the most common claim. But miracles can include everything from finding lost objects to raising the dead. Saints in some traditions become more powerful and active after death than during their lives, and devotees shower them with requests generation after generation. According to some traditions, such as Roman Catholicism, individuals reputed for their holiness in life must show their worthiness to be formally declared saints by having certified miracles attributed to them after death. Healings are the most common wonders needed to bring about the saint's canonization. Special cults, in the sense, not of exclusive religious organizations, but of people who cultivate a particular devotion, of certain saints have developed in some communities. Believers sometimes claim a particular holy person as their patron saint, associating him or her with a particular place and with specific types of miracles. But saints can also develop a more universal following and have Devotees wherever members of a particular tradition are to be found.
Do all traditions have savior figures or redeemers?
Virtually every tradition acknowledges that life is full of difficulties. But not all teach that someone else can rescue people from their problems. Theravada Buddhism, for example, emphasizes self-effort following the example of Buddha the teacher. Sunni Islam teaches that only surrender to God can bring a person's life to a good end. Some saviors, such as bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, effect salvation for humanity purely by extending their power so that individuals are lifted out of their suffering. In those instances, the Savior remains largely above human misery. Some, such as Jesus Christ, work their saving deeds by redeeming or buying back a lost humanity. The notion of redemption presupposes that a savior figure spends him or herself as a kind of ransom. Identifying profoundly with the plight of humanity. This kind of redemptive suffering is relatively rare. Some traditions in which saints are prominent underscore the suffering of some holy persons. But they do not generally effect salvation through their pain.
What were the ancient Greek gods and myths?
Between approximately 850 BCE and 500 BCE, there arose a new Greek religion based on the god Zeus and on 11 other gods who resided on Mount Olympus in Thessaly, in northeastern Greece. The Greek gods were adopted later by the Romans and given different names. The 12 gods made up a family: Zeus, Jupiter to the Romans, the ruler, his brothers Poseidon, Neptune, and Hades, Pluto, their sister Hestia, Vesta, who later gave up her place to Zeus's son Dionysus, Bacchus, Zeus's wife Hera, Juno, their son Ares, Mars, Zeus's children Athena, Minerva, Apollo, Aphrodite, Venus, Hermes, Mercury, and Artemis, Diana, and Hera's son Hephaestus, Vulcan. These Olympians were concerned with and controlled the fate of humankind. Many minor gods were believed to reside on earth and to play a part in the drama of the Olympians and their interaction with the Greek mortals. Zeus sometimes fathered children by mortal women, and the sons became the heroes of Greek legend. The Greeks worshipped their gods as a regular part of their everyday lives. They were careful to please the gods in their actions and were especially careful to avoid angering them. When disaster befell their cities or crops, or when sickness took the lives of loved ones, they believed the wrath of the gods was responsible. The Greek gods also had a humorous side, and the mortals were able to laugh at the gods' plots against one another and at their concealed love affairs. The Greek and Roman myths concerning the activities of the gods and mortals are considered some of the world's greatest literature. Outstanding examples include the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. These and other works presented the ideals of physical beauty and heroic deeds in a poetic form that has inspired civilization since their creation.
What is the freedom of religion in the 20th century?
In March of 1981, after more than 30 years of failed attempts, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights completed a draft declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. After approval by the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly on November 25, 1981. The declaration is a short document with 8 articles. It states that no one should be subject to discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief. That such discrimination should be condemned as a human rights violation. That states should act to prevent and eliminate such discrimination, and that the parents or legal guardians of a child have the right to organize life within the family in accordance with their religion or belief. Although religious liberty was deemed to be better protected by underspecification than by overspecification, the Declaration does enumerate 9 freedoms. Article 6 describes the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as including, but not limited to, the following freedoms: to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief and to establish and maintain places for these purposes. To establish and maintain appropriate charitable or humanitarian institutions. To make, acquire, and use to an adequate extent the necessary articles and materials related to the rites or customs of a religion or belief. To write, issue, and disseminate relevant publications in these areas. To teach a religion or belief in places suitable for these purposes. To solicit and receive voluntary financial and other contributions from individuals and institutions, to train, appoint, elect, or designate by succession appropriate leaders called for by the requirements and standards of any religion or belief. To observe days of rest and to celebrate holidays and ceremonies in accordance with the precepts of one's religion or belief, and to establish and maintain communications with individuals and communities in matters of religion or belief at the national and international levels.
When religion becomes a crime.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 launched a wave of tremendous change in Russia, affecting all aspects and strata of society. When Vladimir Lenin, the principal leader of the revolution, died in 1924, a struggle ensued for control of the party and, by extension, the country. Joseph Stalin emerged as the country's new dictator. By 1929, when longtime rival Leon Trotsky was exiled, Stalin was firmly in power. A ruthless dictator, he quickly set a course of isolationism and nationalism. Policies that would effectively cut the USSR off from much of the rest of Western civilization. Stalin presided over a basic reorientation of Russian culture and society during the 1930s. He instituted severe policies in the realms of art, education, religion, and family life that had a tremendous impact on all Soviet citizens, from the poorest peasant to Moscow's leading intellectuals. This process came to be known as Stalinization. In 1929 laws were passed under which the practice and spread of religion became a crime against the state. Churches were destroyed, priests were stripped of their civil rights, and their children were forced to renounce their fathers or risk death. 3 years later, a program for the total eradication of religion from the Soviet Union was announced. The very notion of God will be expunged as a survival of the Middle Ages and an instrument for holding down the working masses, the official announcement proclaimed. The Communist Party and the Soviet state subsequently established themselves in the place formerly occupied by religion. The study of history, science, the arts, and other subjects also underwent significant change in the 1930s. As the government introduced new conservative standards designed to focus education efforts on increasing worker skills and productivity. Finally, Stalin insisted on a return to traditional family values. Homosexual behavior and abortion were criminalized, divorces were made much more difficult to obtain, and the Marxist-inspired drive for women's emancipation fell into disrepair. To ensure that the masses heeded this new emphasis, it was understood that the state had an obligation to scrutinize all members of Russian society. Thousands were found wanting and were punished severely.
What is a martyr?
The word martyr comes from a Greek word that means witness. Some traditions have made a special place for believers so committed to their faith that they have been willing to die, either in the active spread and defense of the faith or as a way of protesting forced conversion or apostasy. Most people will likely associate martyrdom with Christianity and Islam, but there are numerous examples of unconditional witnessing of religious beliefs and values from a host of traditions. Some examples involve self-immolation or voluntary starvation. Many great religious leaders have engaged in fasting as protest even to death, whether they die in battle or in protest. All martyrs give witness to values they believe are more important than life itself.
What is the difference between a custom and a ritual?
Custom includes a whole range of activities that people in a particular time and cultural setting become so used to doing that they rarely examine their reasons for acting that way. Custom is the way we've always done things. It includes everything from social expectations and etiquette to the specific kinds of food people serve for special occasions. Common law is a type of customary social norm. Its practices have been in use so long that they have assumed legal status and authority. Custom operates at various levels. From that of a society at large to that of the local community and family. Rituals are typically part of the larger category of custom. But ritual practices tend to follow a rigid sequence in the interest of ensuring that the action is correct. For example, it is customary in certain cultures for participants in a wedding to wear certain kinds of clothes. But wedding rituals mandate specific actions in a set order. Even when the principal participants opt for non-customary fashions.
What was the religion of the Maya?
The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica grew out of a very early agrarian way of life. Beginning around 2500 BCE in the tropical rainforest lowlands of northern Guatemala, the area now known as El Petén. Maya civilization has been divided into 5 periods, beginning with the formative period. Around 1500 BCE and ending with the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century. Religion was a major part of the everyday lives of the Maya. With more than 160 different gods, the Maya spent much time fasting, praying, and offering sacrifices to the deities in hopes that they would bring rain and good crops, good health, and good luck. The universal creative force was referred to as Hunabkayu. And the towering ceiba tree was called the Axis Mundi, or Tree of Life, which was thought to reside in all 3 levels of the cosmos. Roots in the underworld, Zibalba, trunk in the middle world, and branches in the heavens. Trees were thought to represent the sustainer of life because of their role in rain cycles. And the Maya believed that when the last tree disappeared, so would the people. The Maya had a corn god, a rain god, a sun god, and a moon goddess, among many others. Each god or goddess influenced a specific part of Maya life. For example, the goddess of the moon, Ninchel, was said to control medicine and weaving. In the great ceremonial centers, priests and priestesses were often involved in vision-producing rites that would supposedly allow them to communicate with the gods. Maya carvings and paintings show men and women ceremoniously piercing parts of their bodies to shed blood and induce higher states of consciousness. Women often pierce their tongues and men their penises, using stingray spines, flints, or thorns. Blood was dripped onto bark paper and the paper was burned as an offering to the gods. Humans, often captured enemy warriors, were ritually sacrificed to appease the gods. The victim would be held down upon an altar and a priest would slit his chest under the rib cage and tear out the heart. Stone carvings of a reclining figure known as the chikmul, which is pictured holding a bowl or platform for a bowl, were thought to be receptacles for sacrificed hearts or blood. Captives were also tortured, bled, and decapitated. Some sacrificial victims were tossed into deep natural water holes. Cenotes, to plead with the rain god for water. When an important person or ruler died, his servants were often killed and buried with him.
What is religious cosmology and what sorts of issues does it address?
Virtually every religious tradition has developed distinctive interpretations of how the world came to be and what it means spiritually. Cosmology, talk or thinking about the cosmos, includes traditional views about time and space and what it means to be embodied. A common element in cosmology is cosmogony or notions of how the cosmos came into being. Creation from nothing is a characteristic theme in Abrahamic cosmogonies. Asian cosmogonies include a wide spectrum of stories, from the spontaneous evolution of the primal egg to the orderly elaboration of each living species, to the playful creative dance of the deity, to the violent sacrifice or dismemberment of the deity itself. Variations on the ancient theory of emanation have made their way into a number of religious traditions, including the Mediterranean systems influenced by Neoplatonism. Cosmologies also typically take a position on the structure or order of the cosmos, offering views as to the origins of human societies and their rituals. This world can be real or illusory, positive or evil, a work of art or the result of haphazard evolution. A mistake even the Supreme Being would like to change or the outcome of careful divine planning. A place to stay forever or a living hell to be escaped at the earliest opportunity. Time and change also occupy cosmological thinking, with linear and cyclical models forming the major options for understanding where it's all heading.
What is a rite of passage?
In the life of every individual, certain times naturally stand out as particularly significant. Birth, the transition from childhood to adulthood, or puberty. The assumption of a new state in life, as in a marriage, and death are especially critical times. Religious traditions generally acknowledge these and other formative experiences by developing rituals designed to help people cope with the changes they bring. Sheer difficulty and challenge can sometimes be the distinguishing features of important moments or phases of a life. Confusion, sense of loss and grief, even overwhelming joy or feelings of limitless possibility can be cause for recourse to the comfort and direction rites of passage can afford. Rituals of this kind help believers by allowing them to step out of ordinary time and space for a while to regain their bearings. They can then return to real life feeling renewed, spiritually refreshed, and strengthened for the challenges ahead.
An important feature in this and other rituals is the emotion or feeling, such as dread or longing or joy. What were the religious sects in America in the 1970s?
In the open cultural climate of the 1960s and 1970s, a variety of religions new to the United States, or previously unnoticed, attracted attention from the press and the general public. Some of these organizations engaged their converts in beliefs and activities that seemed strange by traditional standards. Detractors labeled them cults and warned of their dangers, particularly to the young. Among the best known of these are the following: Hare Krishna. Some of these groups came from India, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which incorporated itself in the United States in 1966. The organization attracted increasing numbers of young people who were called Hare Krishnas by outsiders. In cities with large numbers of hippies, passers-by encountered Hare Krishnas dressed in saffron robes with distinctive haircuts, performing on the streets. Even more visible were the Hare Krishnas soliciting contributions in airport terminals and other public places. Another popular Indian guru was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, of transcendental meditation. In the early 1970s, large numbers of people went to one of 350 training centers where they were given a personal mantra, a word they were to use for engaging in meditation. As it was sometimes called, attracted attention from physicians and psychologists investigating the psychic values of meditation. In 1974, the yogi bought Parsons College in Fairfield, Iowa, and renamed it Maharishi International University. When the yogi's followers began to claim that they could levitate and that their meditation could alter world affairs, the movement went into a decline. Moses David, a group that started as a Christian mission to young people in the California counterculture in the late 1960s, took on cult-like qualities when David Berg, the founder of Teens for Christ, began to see himself as the Messiah. He changed his name to Moses David. While the group's name changed several times, it was best known as the Children of God. Berg and his followers established communes on the West Coast and in Texas. Berg himself went to Great Britain, and his movement proselytized around the world. Moses communicated with his followers in letters, called the Mo letters, that spelled out the terms of his developing set of beliefs. In the course of a decade, over 900 of the Mo letters were published, delivering doctrines that departed increasingly from mainstream Christianity, that it fosters in the participants. Other rituals engage the imagination and intellect primarily, allowing participants to enter into another level of experience through meditation or contemplation, for example. Still, other rituals help believers connect in memory with persons now departed or with past formative spiritual experiences they want to recall.
What kind of literature is the principal source for information on holy persons?
Hagiography, from the Greek terms for sacred writing, Hagiography forms an important literary source in nearly every major religious tradition. Hagiography as a traditional literary genre is quite different from the modern forms of history and biography to which most of us are accustomed. As with sacred scriptures, it is essential to know what kind of document a work of hagiography is. That means reading with different lenses than are appropriate for more contemporary forms of communication. In general, hagiographical writing underscores the amazing and often downright miraculous elements in the life story of an important holy person. More often than not, special signs attend the birth of the individual, who goes on to have an extraordinary childhood. The spiritually precocious youngster often seems to move directly into a religious maturity characterized by feats of towering personal endurance and asceticism. Alternatively, a holy person may spend many years wallowing in immorality and ignorance of the religious tradition's truth, then go through an astounding conversion. Many traditions have produced whole libraries of hagiography that include women's stories, but usually in notably smaller numbers than men's.
Is sacrifice an important feature in many religious traditions?
Sacrifice can take a number of forms, from the actual slaughtering of a living being to a more symbolic offering up of something dear to the sacrificer. The Latin root, sacrum, holy, and facere, to make, suggests that the object sacrificed and the one, performing the action become holy or sacred. Some traditions, such as Islam and Hinduism, continue ancient rites of bloody sacrifice by killing animals, either to commemorate some similar act attributed to an important holy person of the past or because a certain deity requires it. In other traditions, ancient sacrificial rituals have been either abrogated altogether since the destruction of Judaism's temple, or symbolically transformed into an unbloody substitute, as in Christian reenactments of the Lord's Supper.
Are martyrs simply crazy? Are they masochists?
Some, perhaps. A few may not have been authentic witnesses for faith but may have been acting out serious personal problems or merely calling attention to themselves. And in some instances, social pressure is the operative force, making it impossible for certain people not to participate. That too can result in a grotesque distortion of the ideal of committed witnessing. Real martyrs don't necessarily want to die, much less are they possessed by a mania for death.
What is theology and what kinds of questions does it seek to answer?
Theology is talk or thinking, logos, about God, theos, A wide variety of religious traditions naturally engage in some kinds of theology as it is understood in this general sense. Myth at its best is a type of narrative theology. Reflections on the nature of the supreme reality that give rise to story and reenactment of myth in ritual. Some traditions develop the formal discipline of theology much more fully. In those traditions, theology generally does three things. First, it involves a systematic reflection on the basic data, including scripture and or the teachings of a foundational figure. Theologians sort out and organize the major themes, commenting on the original sources with a view to highlighting main ideas about the ultimate reality, or God, humanity, and the material world. In so doing, they effectively help earlier generations of believers to shape the community's master narrative, the guiding account by which believers begin to make sense of their lives. For Jews, it is the story of God's delivering his people from slavery and bringing them to a promised land. For Christians, it is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, in which they see victory over suffering and death, for example. Second, theologians begin to formulate a distinctive way of talking about the tradition's central teachings. At this stage, theological language grows more technical and idiosyncratic. Theology is now using a set of symbols that require some specialized training in the particular tradition to appreciate what the theologians are saying. Finally, theologians articulate those distinctive symbols into a unique system of thought.
What are some of the main themes in religious belief generally?
Statements of belief typically begin with basic statements defining the tradition's supreme being and the principal deeds of that being on behalf of the community of faith. Descriptions of deity and of other spiritual powers figure prominently in many traditions, often in the form of extended narratives that can be extremely elaborate and detailed. Believers in most traditions are taught the array of benefits they can expect from the Supreme Being if only they make appropriate petition. The ways believers ought to respond to the Supreme Being's actions are often paralleled by fundamental ethical considerations governing human relationships. Some traditions place great emphasis on the role of intermediaries or foundational figures, especially concerning their function of delivering a revelation to humankind. Those figures sometimes symbolize the whole history of the Supreme Being's dealings with his or her people. A major theme focuses on notions of the afterlife and on how to achieve the best of rewards and avoid the direst of punishments.
What moral options are available as solutions means to salvation, in other words?
Everything from altruistic service to others to the pursuit of enlightened self-interest. From quiet contemplation to extroverted worship. and from active cultivation of good deeds to hopeful resignation in the face of a foreordained outcome.
What does the term natural theology mean?
Natural theology, sometimes referred to as theodicy, the study of divine justice theodike, is actually a branch of the philosophy of religion. It is called natural to indicate that reason, not revelation, or some other mode of divine communication, is the source of the truths it can discover. This discipline's subject is the nature of the divine being as expressed in what are believed to be the effects of the deity's power in the world. It presupposes, in other words, that human beings can begin with the world as they know it and proceed to some knowledge of the one whose work they believe it to be. Questions about whether God is subject to change, or how a just deity could allow the existence of pervasive evil and suffering in the world, are an important part of the discipline. Natural theology also explores such aspects of the human soul as its ethical freedom and immortality. Forms of natural theology occur in a variety of religious traditions but appear more highly developed in connection with European philosophical traditions.
Are shamans the same as priests?
Shamans belong to the large, general category of priest, which is in turn part of the still larger category of ritual specialist. Women seem to be better represented in the ranks of shamans, depending on the cultural setting, than in priesthoods. In some traditions, shamans are called medicine men or women. A shaman's training tends to include more closely guarded secrets than that of a priest, with greater emphasis on esoteric and arcane practices. Whereas priests more often perform their services as part of larger public settings. The work of the shaman also includes a great deal of private communing with the world of spirits. Shamanistic rites typically involve trances or loss of control, and often include exorcism to expel undesirable spiritual forces. Shamans are key figures in many indigenous or tribal traditions. Even though shamans do not generally find an official place in the major religious traditions, they often appear around the fringes. And the more closely a tradition's beliefs and practices are tied to nature, the more likely will the tradition's ritual specialists share characteristics of the shaman. Some features of shamanistic lore, however, have made their way into the heritage of major traditions. For example, stories in which a prophet or other important personality journeys beyond this world on a trip that can include tours of the various levels of heaven and hell can suggest roots in a shamanistic past.
What is a ritual object or implement?
Ritual objects include a large number of items, both symbolic and Practical, that are the essential devices of religious practice. They may be as outwardly pedestrian as containers for the raw materials of religious offering: rice, salt, wine, bread, or the utensils needed to move those materials around. These tools often have no major symbolic meaning but are largely utilitarian. Though they are generally regarded as sacred because of the context and are not to be used for non-ritual purposes. Many other ritual objects are more symbolic than practical in function. Every tradition has its symbols for the ultimate spiritual reality. For the various kinds of benefits and blessings believers seek from that reality, and for the gifts devotees bring as offerings. Among the most common are images or icons, books or scrolls of sacred text, lamps, musical instruments, weapons, and special vestments or garb for officiants and sometimes participants.
What is a priest?
A socio-religious class called priesthood has ancient roots in various traditions. Some priestly classes have perpetuated themselves through heredity. Some have been intimately associated with the performance of sacrificial ritual, whether bloody or not, and are typically connected with temple or church institutions, both large and small. In some traditions, priests have been celibate as a group. But in most, marriage is a prerequisite for all priests. Most of all, the priest functions as the chief ritual specialist and is often considered a mediator of spiritual power. An indispensable connection between the divine and the human. Even in societies where a hereditary priesthood is the norm, some type of specialized training is generally expected and provided. More often than not, priestly education aims to steep the trainee in the sacred text and its ritual uses, as well as in the ritual actions the priest can be expected to perform hundreds or even thousands of times a year. On the whole, it is safe to say that priests in most traditions are trained less as professional theologians than as public servants commissioned to facilitate the devotional life of the community. Special rituals called ordination in some traditions designed to dedicate individuals to the priesthood often bring the time of training to its culmination. Priesthoods are typically restricted to male membership, though there are some exceptions.
What does the word millennialism mean?
Millennialism, or millenarianism, refers to the general expectation that at a certain point in time human history will undergo a dramatic turnabout, resulting even in the very end of time itself and the beginning of another age. A millennium is literally a 1,000-year period, at the turning of which some communities of faith believe their historic expectation of a new dispensation will be realized. Naturally, the marking of millennial events depends on when a given religious tradition marks its own beginnings. The year 2000 has little or no religious meaning for the great majority of the world's peoples. For the most part, it is only some groups among the world's Christians who attach special significance to this event. But even for Christians the event is ambiguous since, due to anomalies in calendar calculations long ago, it is widely understood that the actual 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus has already come and gone. There is, however, a curiously broad appeal of the notion of millennium. Many have attached a vague sense of foreboding to its imminent arrival beyond concerns about the so-called Y2K computer bug. As we will see later, some traditions have a strong sense of the importance of historic expectation, even if that is not tied specifically to the turn of a true 1000-year millennium.
Chances are you won't catch yourself saying, "Nice story, but did it really happen?"
Yet that is exactly how many people respond to ancient mythic narratives. Either it happened just that way or it's the product of some overworked imagination. Once again, it helps to recall a fundamental principle in the study of classic texts. First, determine how the text is trying to communicate. Myth and poetry share another key feature: they are far more about value and meaning, about why things are the way they are, than about fact. Police reports are about facts. It makes perfect sense to ask whether what is alleged there really happened. Myth, on the other hand, arises out of profound reflection on the human condition and on the nature of the world. Myth invariably articulates a vision of the underlying spiritual causes of things, typically personifying those causes as superhuman powers. In technologically advanced societies, the creative imagination can be too readily discredited. But it is virtually impossible to understand how religion works without a deep appreciation of the imagination. Finally, myth has the power to bring a most welcome element of humor into religious thinking. Thanks to myth at its best, religious people have hope of not taking themselves too seriously.
What is religious anthropology and what questions does it ask?
Virtually all religious traditions develop in considerable detail views of what it means to be a human being. Two especially important themes stand out. First, there are questions about the origin and makeup of the human person. Stories of human beginnings muse over whether we should ascribe them to direct creation, a freak happenstance, or a long process of evolution.
What is myth and why is it so important in the study of religion?
Enduring myth and great poetry have one very important thing in common: both tell the truth without fail. That may come as a shock to readers accustomed to thinking of myth as a synonym for just a story at best. and outright lie at worst. Read a favorite poem aloud.
What is a sage?
Some religious figures are celebrated for their function as living repositories of wisdom. Popular lore may occasionally attribute a wondrous deed to a sage. But the emphasis is decidedly on the person's depth of understanding and insight. Sages are especially important in Jewish and Confucian tradition, for example. They are the people entrusted with preserving the ancient ways, not by mere rote, but also by injecting new meanings that allow adaptation to changing times. In some religious traditions, such as Islam and Hinduism, the religious scholar occupies a special place of honor. But these scholars function on a more practical level than the sages. And Confucian tradition even keeps the two categories more or less clearly separate.
What is the philosophy of religion?
Some philosophers make a specialty of inquiring into the reasonableness of religious belief systems. As far back as Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274, in Europe, Ghazali, d. 1111, and Ibn Rushd, d. 1198, among medieval Muslims, the Hindu Shankara, d. 820, and even back to the Buddhist Nagarjuna, c. 150 to 250, and earlier, religious thinkers have tackled questions of how much truth reason can grasp. Thomas Aquinas' classic 5 proofs for the existence of God are among the most famous inquiries of this type. Philosophers of religion provide a great service in their attempts to keep religious language and truth claims honest, along with philosophical attempts to give a rational justification for religious beliefs, a subspecialty in the philosophy of religion deals with the intricate analysis of various forms of religious expression. It analyzes religious language, ritual, and statements of belief as to their rationality. Virtually every major religious tradition, at some periods during its history, has developed alongside of philosophical schools that have acted as gadflies or devil's advocates.
What is sacred space?
Many religious rituals call for a particular physical setting for their proper and effective performance. Nearly every major religious tradition has developed primary ritual sites dedicated in varying degrees to their chief rituals. Mosques, temples, shrines, synagogues, and churches provide the most important communal sacred spaces. But the degree to which the primary ritual sites are dedicated and restricted to specific ritual actions varies. Some ritual spaces are in effect multi-purpose facilities. and some traditions' rituals simply require no special kind of space. But when local communities of most traditions have grown enough to have bank accounts, plans for dedicated facilities are rarely far behind. Individuals and families in some traditions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Shinto, also perform sacred rituals at home. In those instances, believers often establish a small corner of the house as a sacred space or shrine. Some rituals, such as Islamic daily prayer, believers can perform wherever they happen to be. They simply make that place sacred for the duration of the ritual action by intending it to be so. At the other end of the space spectrum are the holy places associated with particular geographical locations such as holy cities and pilgrimage goals. Some traditions establish perimeters around those places, marking them off as sacred and inviolable, sometimes limiting access to believers only.
What is the purpose of religious rituals?
Religious rituals function primarily to help believers establish relationships of presence, imagination, or memory with the spiritual. There is naturally some overlap among these three goals of ritual. Some rituals effect or mediate a connection between participants and a divine or spiritual presence.
What is eschatology?
Eschatology derives from two Greek words meaning the study, logos, of the last things, eschata. The so-called four last things include death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and the study of them is often called individual eschatology. In addition, cosmic eschatology encompasses religious teaching concerning how history and the world as we know it will come to an end. Although use of the term eschatology has been especially characteristic of the study of the Abrahamic traditions, it can also be useful in describing important aspects of belief in the religious traditions of Asian origin. Religious traditions of Middle Eastern origin have generally developed linear views of history, whereby time is said to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, never again to be repeated. Their eschatologies explore the final and definitive transformations that will befall both individuals and the universe. Traditions of Asian origin tend to favor cyclical views of time. Although each cycle of time is unimaginably long, it is only part of a vast unending potentiality for further variations. As a result, though Asian traditions do talk of various realms of reward and punishment hereafter, they generally do not consider any of those realms to be a truly final destination for the individual. There is always the possibility of yet another existence and another outcome. Many traditions talk of an accountability after death, often describing it as a meeting between the individual soul and a judge or council charged with meting out just deserts. Only a few traditions worldwide, such as Japan's Shinto, have weakly developed notions of afterlife.
Is there any difference between meditation and contemplation?
Meditation and contemplation are important practices in many religious traditions. The two terms are often used synonymously to refer to a prayerful focus on inner spiritual realities. There are, however, some important differences in the methods used for that focusing. It is helpful to keep in mind that there are variations in both theory and practice among the major religious traditions. In general, meditation involves a non-discursive concentration on some object, either verbal or visual. The idea is not to engage in thinking about the object of focus, but merely to allow it to function as a kind of controlled distraction. By targeting the focal object exclusively, the meditator frees up the mind and spirit to achieve a deeper level of simple awareness. Many traditions follow the practice of having a preceptor or spiritual guide assign a specific symbol to each meditator. That symbol can be a word or a phrase, sometimes called a mantra, repeated slowly and deliberately. It can also be an object upon which the meditator concentrates visually, such as a candle flame or a flower. When a meditator becomes aware that the mind is wandering, the solution is to observe "my mind is wandering" or something similar, and return to concentration. Gradually the number and intensity of distractions dwindle. Some traditions allow that there is important intellectual content in meditation, such as a point of doctrine on which the meditator reflects for deeper insight. Contemplation involves a different method. Here the immediate goal is to enter imaginatively into a spiritual reality, and ultimately to be united with that reality. As its Latin root words suggest, the contemplator seeks to become one with or abide in a sacred place, come, with, and templum, temple. Some traditions hold that contemplation is a state of pure intuition beyond any mental content. Others include in their understanding of contemplation the active imaginative entry into an important scene, as if the contemplator were there with the players in some sacred action. Whatever the precise definition or method used in a particular tradition, it is fair to suggest that meditation precedes and prepares for contemplation.
What is a votive offering?
Votive offerings are directly associated with the making of vows. From the Latin votum, something promised, in connection with requests for special favors. When religious believers visit a special holy place, they often write their needs on some object and leave the object within the sacred precincts. They vow to perform certain devotional or charitable acts if the deity will grant their request. Votive offerings include any of hundreds of ways. in which people symbolize their willingness to repay the divine favor. Among the more common devotional acts are those associated with visiting holy places or making pilgrimages. The devotee promises, for example, to approach the place on his or her knees from a certain point, or to make a certain number of prostrations before a particular sacred image. One of the most widespread of votive practices is the lighting of small candles after making an offering to the holy place. In some instances, the use of candles has become dissociated from making vows in the truest sense of that term, so that lighting a wick often merely symbolizes or accompanies a request for divine help. Larger places of worship in many traditions provide appropriate votive offerings for sale in small shops attached to the church, temple, or shrine. For a fee, considered part of the offering, devotees receive an object such as a small statue of a holy person associated with the place, a devotional card, or even a tiny replica of the holy place itself or some part thereof. For example, adherents of Shinto often hang miniature torii gates on racks designed to receive hundreds of them.
What is a votive offering?
Votive offerings are directly associated with the making of vows. From the Latin votum, something promised, in connection with requests for special favors. When religious believers visit a special holy place, they often write their needs on some object and leave the object within the sacred precincts. They vow to perform certain devotional or charitable acts if the deity will grant their request. Votive offerings include any of hundreds of ways in which people symbolize their willingness to repay the divine favor. Among the more common devotional acts are those associated with visiting holy places or making pilgrimages. The devotee promises, for example, to approach the place on his or her knees from a certain point, or to make a certain number of prostrations before a particular sacred image. One of the most widespread of votive practices is the lighting of small candles after making an offering to the holy place. In some instances, the use of candles has become dissociated from making vows in the truest sense of that term, so that lighting a wick often merely symbolizes or accompanies a request for divine help. Larger places of worship in many traditions provide appropriate votive offerings for sale in small shops attached to the church, temple, or shrine. For a fee, considered part of the offering, devotees receive an object such as a small statue of a holy person associated with the place, a devotional card, or even a tiny replica of the holy place itself or some part thereof. For example, adherents of Shinto often hang miniature torii gates on racks designed to receive hundreds of them.
What is meant by the term divination?
Divination comprises a host of specific ritual practices meant to Give practitioners a sense of control in the face of life's mystery. It occurs in association with most religious traditions, if only toward the popular fringe. Divination often involves some form of question and answer exchange.
What is meant by the term divination?
Divination comprises a host of specific ritual practices meant to give practitioners a sense of control in the face of life's mystery. It occurs in association with most religious traditions, if only toward the popular fringe. Divination often involves some form of question and answer exchange.
What was religion in ancient Rome?
Like the ancient Greeks, early Romans practiced a form of religion that recognized many gods. As Roman and Greek culture came into closer contact throughout the classical period, Romans began to borrow many Greek religious beliefs, and more ancient Etruscan gods took on the characteristics of Greek gods. Thus, for instance, the Roman Jupiter, the king of gods, became associated with the Greek Zeus. Ceremonies and superstitions played a significant role in the daily lives of Romans. Omens from nature often influenced the actions of leaders, and priests divined the intent of gods by observing the organs of slaughtered animals or the flight of birds. As time passed, Roman religion began to lose favor among the people. As Roman society became more decadent, there arose the need for a religion that offered greater moral and spiritual assurances. A new religion, Christianity, gained in popularity and eventually became the primary faith of Rome. In addition to Greek culture influencing religion in Rome, other facets of Roman culture were also affected by the Greeks. The Romans held significant esteem for Greek life and adopted certain elements from it, ranging from sculpture to libraries, architecture to philosophy, while preserving some of their own valuable strengths. The result of this merging of ideas is known as Greco-Roman culture.
What was religion in ancient Rome?
Like the ancient Greeks, early Romans practiced a form of religion that recognized many gods. As Roman and Greek culture came into closer contact throughout the classical period, Romans began to borrow many Greek religious beliefs, and more ancient Etruscan gods took on the characteristics of Greek gods. Thus, for instance, the Roman Jupiter, the king of gods, became associated with the Greek Zeus. Ceremonies and superstitions played a significant role in the daily lives of Romans. Omens from nature often influenced the actions of leaders, and priests divined the intent of gods by observing the organs of slaughtered animals or the flight of birds. As time passed, Roman religion began to lose favor among the people. As Roman society became more decadent, there arose the need for a religion that offered greater moral and spiritual assurances. A new religion, Christianity, gained in popularity and eventually became the primary faith of Rome. In addition to Greek culture influencing religion in Rome, other facets of Roman culture were also affected by the Greeks. The Romans held significant esteem for Greek life and adopted certain elements from it. Ranging from sculpture to libraries, architecture to philosophy, while preserving some of their own valuable strengths. The result of this merging of ideas is known as Greco-Roman culture.